Adam's calling from North Carolina, pronouns are him. Adam is a theist who says your birthday wish is going to come true. I have convincing evidence for God, at least I think so. Adam, welcome to the show. How are you?
Hey, I'm doing pretty well. Happy birthday to both of you, or is it just Matt?
Mine was Monday. Jimmy's was
early March, but we missed the usual event that we do.
We had other obligations on the day we were going to do our joint birthday thing, so we're doing it late, but it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Understood. Well, happy belated. I think my initial claim was a little bit more modest. I hope to present you with something that might at least change your mind to a certain extent. But I'm happy to be on. So did you have any questions for me initially, or did you want me to just get right to it?
Which God are you going to prove?
Well, I am a Christian.
Okay, never mind. I was going to say before you answer, I want to write down what I think you're going to, the direction you're going to go, but it's already spoiled now that you said you're Christian. Go ahead.
Okay. So,
okay.
What evidence do you have that you think should convince us that some version of the Christian God exists?
Right. So I kind of start from, is theism or naturalism more likely to be true?
Okay, that's already a big problem.
Okay.
Because
can I ask why?
Yeah, because that's a question that is not a proper dichotomy. Theism and naturalism.
Not a dichotomy.
Yes. So when you ask a question, is theism or naturalism more likely to be true? You already poisoned the well with a false dichotomy, but that's not evidence.
Well, so let me get my thought out here and then feel free to critique. So I acknowledge that there are other views, but from what I remember, both of you are naturalists. And just like most of the discussions I've had, philosophers I've read.
No. I you don't understand this. For 20 fucking years, I've been saying I am not a philosophical naturalist. I'm a methodological naturalist. I have no idea whether or not anything supernatural exists, and I don't think anybody else does either. And I don't know how anyone would ever demonstrate that anything supernatural exists or that it can interact with reality in any detectable way. But I am not a philosophical naturalist, because philosophical naturalism asserts that the natural world is in fact all that exists, and I don't know.
Okay. Well, my apologies then. I guess what I was trying to start with was I kind of weighed it, because to me, those are the two most likely. Maybe you could weigh in deism, but for this specific argument, this would kind of lump in the potential between deism and theism, and then from there you would determine whether deism or theism is more likely to be true. I think, like, at the very top level, without like getting down into more specific worldviews, those are like at the very top level: naturalism or some form of no God, as opposed to theism and then deism.
So we just spent all this time with you saying the most likely options are that there is a God or there isn't a God. Those are the only options, not just the most likely ones.
Right, but I want to make sure I'm.
But if there are only two options, if there are only two options, either there is a God or there's not a God, then you don't need to say that those are the two most likely. Those are the two only possibilities, and you're trying to demonstrate that one of them is correct. And you said you had convincing evidence for it. So what is it?
Sure. So I think that the Kalam is a good argument, but I think that the traditional ways that it's been defended actually fail. I think William Lane Craig himself, the biggest proponent of the Kalam, actually doesn't defend it in the way that he should. He uses arguments that I think, like Grim Reaper type defenses, that I think have problems. And so I have a defense of the Kalam. Yeah.
What's the conclusion of the Kalam cosmological argument?
The universe has a cause.
Yeah. Does the Kalam cosmological argument include the word God at all?
No, but this would be a starting point.
So it's not only not evidence, it's not even an argument for the existence of God. It is an argument for the universe having a cause, which means in order to get to a God, you need to then come up with evidence that adds in what that kind of cause can be. I think the Kalam is horribly flawed, as I've done multiple videos and debates. I think the first premise is problematic, and so is the second one. But for the sake of today, let's just, only for the sake of argument, grant you that the universe has a cause. How do you demonstrate that that cause is God?
So I think it's best to look at what our options are at this point. Obviously, we can't really use the scientific method to determine
why not
beyond the universe. Beyond the universe? I mean, we could, but
why do you think there is anything beyond the universe at all? I'm not aware that that's even a possibility.
So if the universe began to exist,
that's not the case.
From a state of non-existence to exist.
That's not the case.
You went.
I reject the assertion. I reject the premise that the universe began to exist. You haven't demonstrated that the universe or the things in the universe didn't always exist in some form or another.
Okay, I thought you were granting the Kalam, so my apologies. So
I'm granting for the sake of argument that the universe has a cause. I reject the Kalam on both premises.
Okay, so I guess, should we move to try to defend the Kalam, or should we move as if we've accepted the Kalam and then why the cause? I think the best explanation is theism.
Well, wow, I don't know why this is so difficult. I'm giving away the farm and saying I will go ahead and concede for the sake of this argument that the universe has a cause. What is your convincing evidence that that cause is God?
Okay, so what I was saying before was that if the universe began to exist, right, from a cause, this would mean that something that must be beyond the universe, or at least outside of our physical universe, whether it's a universe immaterial generating machine of some sort, or a theistic God, or perhaps a series of universes creating new universes somehow over and over again.
How do you tell which one of those is true?
So we can try to find, like, what's the best explanation from either a Bayes perspective?
No, you can't. Nope. So first of all, I'm not going to accept abductive arguments. But also, you don't have enough information to determine what are the possible explanations and which are most likely, because we have no ability to investigate beyond our universe. How do you determine that God is more probable than a universe-generating pixie?
So we could use, well, first let me ask you, what do you mean by universe-generating pixie? Can you elaborate on that?
You listed several possible things for what might explain the origin of the universe in its present state, whether it's a multiverse, a series of universes, a God, a universe, and I added in a universe-generating pixie. You have several candidate explanations there, none of which have been demonstrated to actually be candidate explanations. You're just assuming that you should be able to include those as candidates, even though there's no demonstration that they are in fact even possible. There may be, even if one of them has to be correct, there's no demonstration that any individual one of them is possible at all. And so you don't even know that you have candidate explanations. But my question was, how do you tell which of those candidate explanations is more probable when you can't demonstrate that any individual one is possible and you have no way to investigate them?
So from a possibility perspective, I mean, so long as there's not a logical contradiction, I think it's at least plausible to investigate it. Like, there's no sense in investigating a contradiction.
This Adam, I apologize. This is I'm going to use the word dishonest, but I don't think that you're intentionally being dishonest. This is the dishonest aspect about apologetics. Because what you just described is we have no way to demonstrate whether or not it is in fact possible, but you find it plausible. I don't, and I don't care. And I don't care who finds it plausible. I care what is demonstrably possible and what is probable in order to determine what is most likely. You don't get to just say, I find it plausible, therefore I get to include it, and therefore I can determine that it's more probable than some other explanation. There needs to be demonstrations.
If I wanted to play that game, I would just be hypothetically the proponent of simulation theory, which you would have been incapable of defeating with your magic theory. Adam, I'm curious, of all the people, you said you're a Christian. Would you mind sharing what kind of Christian you are?
Protestant.
Okay. Do you actively go to a church?
Yeah.
Of the people in your congregation, what percentage of them believe in God for the same reason, the same defense that you're presenting right now, that this is their reason why they believe God exists?
Very few.
Any besides you?
Yeah, my men's group, they do, but there's very few.
So it's a very small percentage. So would you at least then acknowledge, if you think that this is the way to get there, but the other ways don't really get there, would you acknowledge that all of your other Protestant friends don't have good reasons for believing?
It's totally possible. I mean, I haven't asked everybody in my church, but I've met several other Christians that don't, to me at least, have good reasoning. If you have a personal experience, that's totally okay. But I've heard some pretty interesting reasons that people believe. Don't get me wrong.
How much do you advocate at your church that people believe for your better reason versus the reasons they have?
Oh, I've started a group in order to get closer to folks in the church, and to try to just go through like what we actually believe to begin with, let alone why we believe. I 100% agree. There are tons of Christians today, self-proclaimed Christians, that don't really have a strong foundational understanding of the faith, of church history, let alone like what theism is. I can ask half the people in my church what God is, and they may not be able to answer that question coherently.
I think you think I was going a different direction with this. The main direction that I'm wanting to go here is pointing out that it's always interesting talking to people like you, because the answer generally is what you've already sort of established. Not really. Most of the other people don't believe it that. And it seems to me that mostly this line of thinking is a sort of probably mental defense for yourself, as well as to be able to have conversations with people like us on the outside of your religion, to put up this sort of sophistry, nonsensical, doesn't actually add up when you start to pick it apart, defense of your belief in God, but you aren't advocating for your fellow believers who apparently, not in any significant way, apparently would be mostly believing for not good enough reasons. And I think it's kind of telling to what the utility of these actual arguments are when this is what we're facing.
And a side note, I don't know. That's irrelevant to whether or not your argument's sound or valid or whatever else, but it's still, it's something we hear over and over again. So, I mean, Jimmy's right in the sense that, what are you going to do when you become convinced that you also don't have a good reason, and then you've been teaching all these people who didn't have good reasons your better reason, and then you find out, wait, my better reason was based on a notion of possibility and plausibility that just isn't accurate to reality.
Yeah, so, I mean, we could do without the psychoanalysis or the pseudo-psychoanalysis. Like, to claim my motive, that just doesn't seem to contribute to the argument at all.
I just gave you an out for that.
People, not you, Jimmy. But
yes, I understand that, which is why I interrupted to say that.
Okay, so if I'm wrong, right, then I'll have to apologize to my group. I believe that this is correct. And so I have justifications for my belief. Now, there's also utility in this belief, like from a pragmatic sense.
You don't, though, have justifications. When I asked you, you called in to say you have convincing.
You haven't even let me make my arguments.
Okay, you can start whining about that now, but in reality, you called in to say you had convincing evidence. And every time I've asked you about this, not only have you not presented evidence, you have gone down a road where you are going to consider candidate explanations where there's no demonstration of even possibility, but you find them plausible. Do you not see why that's a problem?
I haven't really been able to flesh out my point to begin with.
I'm sorry, I asked you a specific question right there. The reason you haven't been able to flesh out your thing is because you started with bad arguments and flawed reasoning from the beginning, and it's my job to make that clear.
What's my bad arguments and flawed reasoning?
I already pointed that out. It's my job to make that clear so that we don't spend 10 minutes of you going down a path that is flawed from the beginning. And the flawed from the beginning is that the Kalam says nothing about God. You have to add to it for that. So we went ahead and skipped and granted you all of that. And then it is, how do you tell what the potential candidate explanations for the change in state of the universe is? And you listed some without demonstrating that they're possible. And when called out that they hadn't had any demonstration of even possibility, you went to it's plausible, which is just saying you find it compelling, which is irrelevant. And I asked you just a minute ago, do you not see the problem with that? And instead of answering me, you went on to say something else. Do you not see a problem with asserting that your assessment that it's plausible is sufficient to ignore the fact that there's been no demonstration even of possibility?
So what I actually did was I established a criteria to start with.
I'm sorry, I asked you a specific question and then came back and asked you the same question again, and you are now trying to tell me what you said instead of answering the question. Do you not
because
see
you're misrepresenting what I said?
Do you not see that there is a problem with asserting that something is a viable candidate explanation because you personally find it plausible, despite the fact that there is no demonstration that it is even in fact possible? Do you not see a problem there?
So you're leaving out purposefully the criteria.
Okay, I'm going to mute you.
Purposefully. Wait, I thought we were upset with assigning motivations. Wasn't that a thing?
I want you to answer my fucking question. When we list candidate explanations, we don't get to include candidate explanations without a good reason. We should not be able to include candidate explanations without a demonstration that they are possible, which is why I asked you if you could demonstrate that it was even possible. And your response was to say it was plausible, which is basically an assertion that you are convinced of it. But that is not a demonstrated possibility. So I'll ask you this question again in a slightly different way. If somebody offers you candidate explanations that you have no reason to believe are even possible, how do you respond? And now I will unmute you.
Okay, if I have no reason to believe that they're possible, is that what you said?
Yes.
Okay, if I have no reason to believe that they're possible, like they're logically contradictory, then I wouldn't take what they have to say seriously.
Adam, that is not at all a correct understanding of what I said. And I'm going to explain it real quick. I didn't say if you believe they are impossible, and you gave a reason why you might think something is impossible because it's logically contradictory. I said if you don't have reason to believe it is possible. That is completely different from whether or not you have a reason to believe it's impossible. So if they make a candidate explanation that you have no reason to believe is possible, and they offer you no demonstration that it is possible, how do you respond to that?
I mean, it depends on what we're talking about, but I would probably be very skeptical.
No, it shouldn't. It shouldn't depend on what you're talking about. That's the point. That's what logic is. Logic is content agnostic. And so if somebody says, I'm going to give you a candidate explanation that we have not demonstrated as possible, and I will not show as possible, how do you deal with that?
I just answered that. I would be skeptical.
I don't think you know what skeptical means, but okay.
For example, when you did that, I was skeptical, and that's why I threw it out.
When somebody tells me they have a candidate explanation that they cannot demonstrate as even possible, that candidate explanation is no longer a candidate. It does not get to be considered as a candidate explanation until it has been demonstrated to be possible, plausible, and truly a candidate explanation for the phenomenon we're trying to explain. Otherwise, I would have to take every untestable, unfalsifiable, I don't know if it's possible or not. Maybe I farted a universe out. Is that possible? I don't know, but you didn't show it was impossible, so we get to conclude that as a candidate. This is why we need to demonstrate how and why something should be considered a candidate explanation. That's the only point I was trying to make. Hopefully that's clear.
That is exactly what I was attempting to do.
You're so full of shit. You're so full of shit. If you actually were attempting to do that, you would have answered the question when I first asked, instead of saying you find it plausible.
So before I said I find it plausible, I said the first metric of criteria is that it can't be a contradiction. I don't understand why you argue with that. Do you not agree?
Okay, because, Captain not fucking listening, whether or not it is logically contradictory is irrelevant to the question. If something is logically contradictory, that would definitely mean it's impossible. But there are other things that are not fucking possible, even though they're not logically contradictory, they are empirically contradictory. It is not possible for me to flap my wings and fly based on all of the information that I have. And so if somebody says, hey, is it possible for Matt to flap my wings and fly? You can't say that's logically contradictory, because it's not. There are other ways in which we evaluate whether or not something is possible. And yet every time I try to get you to understand the distinction between I am not convinced that X is possible and I am convinced that X is impossible, you only, every single time, go to logical contradiction. That is not enough. That is not the only thing that determines whether or not something is possible. Try again.
I agree. I was just starting there.
You started
there.
You started with something that. No. Okay, Adam, you know what I'm going to do now? Hey, Jimmy.
What's up?
I cut him off.
I just enjoyed the the fit over not getting to finish his argument that began with a plea for us to concede to him an argument which already was flawed from the ground up.
Yep. I've been over backwards to just go ahead and grant the conclusion of the Kalam despite the problems with the Kalam. The universe had a cause. And by that, I mean, whatever the current presentation of the universe is, there is some explanation for it, including the universe always existed and changed. Oh, but there needs to be some external motivation for change. Sure, whatever. How do you make a list of what the possible candidate explanations are? Well, I think one of them should be God. Well, whoop-de-fucking-do. You have to make a demonstration that it's possible and then go on to show that it is plausible and probable, and eventually, this is the best explanation. And you don't just get to say, well, it's possible as long as it's not logically contradictory. That is a philosophical, analytic possibility that has nothing to do with the synthetic empirical possibility of whether or not that can actually happen in reality. I don't know how many different ways to explain that, but when I spend all this time correcting an obvious flaw and teaching you, you don't think it to say, well, I already knew that and that's where I was going. Then why did you waste my motherfucking time on all the other stuff? Why didn't you just say, I think God is possible because X. I think God is plausible because X. I think God is probable because X. Instead, you went with, well, I didn't say possible, go with plausible. Like, yo, dude, I'm convinced.
Hello, everyone. I'm Jimmy Snow. I'm the executive producer of The Line. And at night, I sneak into Matt Dillahunty's house and I trade his cereals for other cereals. He comes out and he's like, wait, these are cereals I buy, but I swear I had different cereals. Anyway, would you like to support this channel or any specific show? You can do so over on Patreon or in channel memberships. There are special tiers for special shows or for the channel at large, and it helps us expand programming as well as hopefully very soon launch it in podcast form. Now, also, if you'd like to support, you can like, you can subscribe, you can leave a comment or a super thanks, which is a special highlighted comment that you pay for. Those are fun. And, screw the algorithm, go check out something over here, I suppose. Boy, I hope I can still put those icons there, because if I can't, this is going to look really stupid. I'm going to go buy some Cocoa Puffs and switch out Matt's mini wheats now.